Good morning, everyone. This is the class for BSc Honors. All BSc Honors students, you are attending the class. Okay. Now, this is your third class as far as your environmental studies is concerned. And I think we have already touched upon the first two chapters. And I have also provided you with some study material pertaining to the first two chapters. Okay, so in today's class, we shall begin our discussion with the third chapter, where we will have some primary discussions about the ecosystem, and obviously connected to it is ecology. Now, as far as ecology is concerned, now it has been coined from the combination of two Greek words, oikos and logos. So oikos practically refers to your household, and logos practically refers to the study. So ecology, in brief, we can define it as the study of the earth's households. We can define it as the study of the earth's household. And this term ecology, for the first time, as far as literature is concerned, it was used for the first time by Ernst Haeckel, by the scientist Ernst Haeckel. And if you think of it in a broader sense, practically it is the study of interactions between living organisms and the interactions with their non-living environment. So living organisms, whenever they are in a state of living, they have to enter into a state of interaction. So they will not only interact with other living organisms, but they also need to interact with their non-living environment, because there is a continuous exchange of matter and energy between the living beings and as well as the abiotic environment. So ecology is the science of interrelationship. It is the science of interactions, where we study how living organisms interact with other living organisms as well as the ecosystem as a whole, as well as the non-living environment as a whole. Now, study of ecology, now there are several types and several subdivisions of ecology, multiple types. So we will talk about two principal types. One is auticology and the other is synecology. One is auticology and the other is synecology. So if we are talking of auticology, auticology refers to the ecology of an individual species. Auticology refers to the ecology of an individual species, and synecology refers to the ecology of a community. So auticology is the ecology of an individual species, and synecology is the ecology of a community. So what's the difference between a species and a community? So as far as a species is concerned, a species is a group of organisms occupying a particular place at a particular unit of time, who can interbreed among themselves and produce fertile offsprings. So a species refers to the group of organisms who occupy a particular space in a particular unit of time and who interbreed among themselves to produce fertile offsprings. Now, if we are talking of community, a community is polyspecific. That means different kinds of organisms belonging to different species will be occupying that particular place and in that particular unit of time. And obviously, for successful existence of a community, there has to be interactions. So whenever we are talking of auticology, we will be focused on study of an individual species, and if we are talking of synecology, we are interested in the ecology or the study of particular community. Now, after discussing these basic aspects of ecology, let us talk about an ecosystem. Now, as far as an system is concerned, any system you can think of, it consists of several interacting components which operate as a functional whole. Any system, if you can think of, it consists of several interacting components operating as a functional whole. Likewise, if you think of an ecosystem practically consists of several interacting organisms which, along with their non-living environment, operate as a functional whole, that is a system, and which in ecological terms we call it as an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is a group of interacting organisms which, along with their environment, operate as a system. Okay, and this term ecosystem, for the first time, it was coined by A.G. Tansley, Professor Arthur Tansley, way back in 1935. And these ecosystems which we are talking of, now these ecosystems are one of the fundamental basis of life on this planet. So if these ecosystems do not work properly, if they do not function properly, life cannot be ensured, life cannot continue towards perpetuity on this planet. Okay, now every ecosystem practically has two features. One, you can call it as the structural feature of the ecosystem, and the other is the functional feature of the ecosystem. Now, whenever we are talking of the structural features, that means we are relating to all those ecosystem aspects. We are referring to all those ecosystem elements which will help to make up the ecosystem, and these structural features, they may include abiotic components or biotic components. Now, as far as the abiotic components are concerned, obviously the name suggests that these are all the non-living components. So they may be some organic compounds like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, etc., or there may be some inorganic compounds which ultimately are the building blocks of these organic compounds, like say carbon, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water, etc. And then every ecosystem has a climatic regime. That means we are also taking into consideration the various factors which contribute to climate. Say for example, say temperature, maybe light, say moisture availability, or the particular topography of that place, how that place looks, whether it's a plain land, or whether it's a hilly area, or whether it's some kind of a plateau, etc., etc. So these are the abiotic components as far as your structural features are concerned. Now, the structural feature of an ecosystem is not only made by abiotic components, but there is definitely some kind of a biotic touch to it. Now, the biotic components, they include the living components, and we all are aware of it. They will primarily include the three basic living components, like which you call as producers, consumers, and decomposers. Now, as far as your producers are concerned, now these producers are practically referring to, when we are talking of producers, we are practically referring to as the plant communities. Why plant communities? Because they have the technology to produce their own food via the technology of photosynthesis, because they have a magic pigment called the chlorophyll, and so they are photosynthetic. They can utilize light to prepare their own food, and because they can prepare their own food, that is why we are calling them as autotrophs. Auto means self and troph means nourishing. Now, there is another class of organisms who can also produce their food on their own, but not with the assistance of light, but rather with the assistance of chemicals. And these organisms who can synthesize their own food with the assistance of chemicals, we call them as chemosynthetic. And there are different kinds of bacteria available which are chemosynthetic. So whenever we are talking of producers practically include the photosynthetic plants as well as the chemosynthetic microorganisms. Then comes your consumers. The consumers, they primarily include the animals. The consumers primarily include the animals, and as far as the animals are concerned, they are not in a position to prepare their own food. So they are called heterotrophs. That means they are nourished by others. And these consumers may be your primary consumer, who are mostly herbivores, and who directly obtain their food from the green plants. And you may have secondary consumers who are dependent in turn on the primary consumer. So if the primary consumers are herbivorous, the secondary consumers, they are carnivorous. That means they are flesh eating, they are meat eating, and they are dependent on the primary consumers. And then comes your tertiary consumers. Now, the tertiary consumers invariably are your again flesh eating organisms, and they primarily feed upon the secondary consumers to meet their needs. Now, after talking about the consumers, the next biotic component, which is primarily the recycling agent of the ecosystem, they will include the decomposers. And they primarily include your bacteria, some fungi, and they are extremely important as far as an ecosystem structure is concerned, because they will decompose the dead and decaying bodies of plants, animals, etc. And in the process of such decomposition, the locked or trapped nutrients within the dead bodies are released back into the ecosystem. So that ensures there is a constant recycling of these nutrients. Otherwise, if organisms die with nutrients and there isn't a way to get back those nutrients back to the ecosystem, then obviously we will be suffering from nutrient crisis throughout the world. Okay, so structural features of an ecosystem, they contribute to make up the ecosystem. Structural features can be abiotic or biotic. The biotic structural features will include producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers, in turn, will consist of photosynthetic and chemosynthetic organisms. Consumers, they can be further subdivided into primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, or even you can move on to quaternary consumers. And lastly comes your decomposers, which are helping in your recycling of the nutrients taken up from the ecosystem. Now, as far as the abiotic components are concerned, uh, the structural part of the abiotic components, now they can be organic compounds, inorganic compounds, or the climatic regime involved there. Now, after talking about these structural features, we shall talk about the functional features. Now, functional aspects practically refer to all those processes and all those interactions which are performed by the organisms which are present in that ecosystem. So whenever we are talking of the functional aspects are practically referring to all those processes and all those interactions which are performed by the organisms which are present in the ecosystem, and they include your energy cycles. That means we are referring here to as your biogeochemical cycles, about which we shall discuss in a later class. Then it will include your food chains, which is invariably a functional component of the ecosystem. Then comes your ecosystem diversity. Then there are different kinds of, as I said just now, nutrient cycles, energy cycles, etc. And lastly, one of the key functional aspect will also include your ecological succession. So functional aspects refer to all those processes and functions which the organisms in an ecosystem perform. They include your, as I said, energy and nutrient cycles. They include food chains. They will include ecosystem diversity, and at the same time, they will also include ecological succession. Now, after talking about these basic types, these basic features of the ecosystem, now let us slightly talk a bit about the ecosystem components. We should talk about the ecosystem components. Okay. Now, as far as ecosystem components are concerned, this is already known to you that it will mainly consist of the biotic and abiotic components. I will not be discussing upon them now. The biotic components will include the living, which can be producers, consumers, decomposers, etc. And the abiotic components, they will include your non-living entities, and they are very essential for life also. Say for example, if you think of sunlight, which is the primary energy source for majority of the natural ecosystems. They are solar sun subsidized practically. And then you have your temperature, you have moisture, precipitation, the minerals present in the soil. So there are a whole list or a whole set of what you can say abiotic components which influence life, which influence the functioning of an ecosystem. Now, as far as feeding habits are concerned, let us just look into a few more feeding habits. So, those who can prepare their own food, primarily the producers, we are calling them as autotrophs. Those who cannot produce their own food and in turn are dependent on others for for meeting their food and energy needs, we are calling them as heterotrophs. Now, those who are feeding primarily on vegetable matter, we are calling them as herbivores. Those who are feeding primarily on meat and flesh, we are calling them as carnivores. Now, there are also organisms which feed upon both. Say, for example, human beings, the bear. Now, all these organisms who feed upon both vegetable as well as meat and flesh, we call them as omnivores. Omni means large. It's a large feeding range that they have. Okay, now apart from that, we shall also come across terms like saprotrophs. We can also come across terms like saprotrophs. So, saprotrophic organisms are those which meet their food as well as energy requirements by decomposing the dead. So, saprotrophs are those who feed upon the dead and decay. So, that is from where they meet their food and energy requirements. Okay. Now, after talking about all these things, let us come down to what we call as the food chain. Let us come down to what we call as the food chain. Now, before we come down to food chain, let us understand the meaning of a term called a trophic level. Now, in any food chain, there are various levels which are occupied by organisms. So, these levels which are present in the food chain are what we call as your trophic levels, and they include your what you can say producers, from the producers to primary consumers, from primary to secondary, secondary to tertiary consumers, and from tertiary to quaternary, and it continues. So essentially, food chain is a linear pattern in which organisms are arranged with repeated eating and being eaten. So, food chain is a linear pattern in which organisms are arranged with repeated eating and being eaten. Now, these food chains, as you can see, that they are very essential. Why? Because these food chains allow transfer of energy. So, that is what matters in an ecosystem. That is energy transference. Because if from a particular trophic level to the other trophic level, if from a particular organism to another organism, the food energy does not flow, then ecosystems cannot be sustained, life cannot be sustained. So this process of eating and being eaten is very important in an ecosystem, and the linear pattern in which we arrange the organisms with repeated eating and being eaten is what we call as a food chain. Now, these food chains, again, there are different kinds of food chains, but we shall primarily focus upon two types. One is the grazing food chain, and the other is the detritus food chain. Now, grazing food chain, you can abbreviate and call it as GFC, and the detritus food chain, you can abbreviate and call it as the DFC. Now, there is a certain difference between the grazing and the detritus food chain. Now, as far as the grazing food chain is concerned, it mainly begins with the producers, and from the producers it will move on to the consumers, the primary, secondary, tertiary, and it is directly dependent on solar influx. Now, this is one of the key features of the grazing food chain, that is, it is directly dependent on solar influx. So you cut down the sun and the grazing food chain will collapse. Now, a very simple example of a grazing food chain which we can think of is, say, the food chain begins with grass. A producer, from the grass which is fed upon by the grasshopper. The grasshopper is the primary consumer. From the grasshopper, which in turn will be fed upon by the frog, which is the secondary consumer. The frog in turn will be fed upon by the snake, which is the tertiary consumer, and from the snake, which will be fed upon by the eagle, which is the quaternary consumer. So what we find that in a grazing food chain, it all begins with producers. From producers, it moves down to a whole set of consumers. So that is how the energy also continues to flow. Now, as far as the detritus food chain is concerned, so first we need to understand what exactly is detritus. Now, detritus is practically dead and decomposing organic matter, which can be a plant or an animal origin. So, detritus is essentially organic matter, dead and decomposing organic matter, which can be of plant or animal origin. Now, as you can understand, that as a grazing food chain begins with the producer, a detritus food chain begins with this dead and decomposing plant or animal matter, which you are calling as detritus. Now, from the detritus, the food chain will move on to the detritivore. So, what is a detritivore? Detritivores are those organisms which feed upon the detritus, and from the detritivore, the food chain will progress onto the carnivores of those detritivores. That means onto those organisms which feed upon the detritivores, and that is how the chain will proceed. So a detritus food chain, or a DFC, it is not directly dependent on solar influx for its continuity, unlike a grazing food chain which is directly dependent on solar influxes. So these are some of the basic differences between a GFC and a DFC. So if you can think of an example of a DFC, say in a forest there are some fallen leaf litter, a lot of leaves, dead leaves, dried leaves have fallen to the forest floor, and those leaves maybe are fed upon by some insects. Now, if you consider those leaves to be the detritus, the insects, the worms, the helminths, etc., you can consider them to be the what you can say detritivore. Now, these insects or worms, whatever, they in turn are being fed upon by birds. So the birds are the what you can say the carnivores. The birds are feeding upon those detritivores. So the food chain begins with detritus, moves on to the detritivore, and from the detritivore it moves on to the carnivores on these detritivores. So these are the two basic types of food chains which you need to study for your examination purpose. Now, after we have talked about food chains, the next thing which we shall invariably discuss, which is also a very important part of your syllabus, that is energy flow through the ecosystem. Now, if we are moving on to energy flow, just before touching energy flow, just one more topic I will just discuss in brief, that is a food web. Now you know that in a natural ecosystem, it is not possible to find a food chain in isolation. So you don't find natural ecosystems where only a singular food chain is existing, or whether several isolated food chains are existing. So that is not possible in nature. But what we find in nature is that there are several interconnected or interlinked food chains which gives rise to something which we call as a web, or more correctly as the food web. So a food web practically represents the interlinking pattern of several interlinked food chains. So what does a food web represent? A food web represents the interlinking pattern of several interlinked food chains. Now, after talking about these food webs, next we shall talk about energy flow. Now, from your knowledge of chemistry or physics or thermodynamics, whatever, you know that energy is practically the capacity to do work. Energy, as far as thermodynamics is concerned, you call it as it is the capacity to do work. And in an ecosystem, until and unless there is a smooth flow of energy from the producers to the consumers to the decomposers, etc., ecosystem functioning will be absolutely halted, it will be hampered. So what has to be done? There must be an insurance of a smooth energy flow through the various trophic levels of the ecosystem. Now, this energy flow you can practically define as the flow of energy, primarily in the form of food, from one trophic level to other in an ecosystem or in a food chain. And how? This energy flows because there is a relationship of eating and being eaten. So because this relationship of eating and being eaten continues, that is why we find that energy flows from one food level to the next. And this energy flow definitely has some characteristic features. Say for example, energy flow in an ecosystem obeys the first and second law of thermodynamics. Energy flow in an ecosystem obeys the first and second law of thermodynamics. Now, all of you have studied thermodynamics in your lower classes, in class 11 and 12, and you know that thermodynamics is practically the study of heat and energy flow. So it has two basic laws. Now, as far as the first law is concerned, that it says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it can only be transformed from one form to the other. That is the first law. And as far as the second law of thermodynamics is concerned, the second law tells us that whenever there is transformation of energy from one form to the other, some amount of energy is always lost as unavailable heat. So these are the two basic laws of thermodynamics. The first law tells us that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and it can only be transformed from one form to other. And as far as the second law is concerned, the second law tells us that whenever there is transformation of energy from one form to other, there will obviously some form of energy which will be lost as unavailable heat. Now, energy flow through ecosystems, they will invariably follow these two fundamental laws of thermodynamics. Now, this is one of the characters of energy flow. The other character which we can think of is that energy flow is always unidirectional. That is, it always flows in a particular direction and it cannot be reverted. So once energy has flown from the producer to the primary consumer, and from the primary to the secondary consumer, there is no way, there is no technology to bring back the energy from a succeeding food level to a preceding food level. So you can't back the chicken which you have eaten. That is not possible. So once energy has flown, uh, uh, you cannot get it back, and energy flow is always what you can say unidirectional. That is always flowing in a particular direction. And then, as far as energy source is concerned, source of energy for majority of these natural ecosystems is your the sun. So the sun is practically what you can say that it is the boss of this planet. It is the boss of the solar system as a whole. So you cut down the sun and everything will crash down. So for all ecosystems, majority of the what you can say natural ecosystems, the sun is the primary source. Now there are a few ecosystems where sun is not the primary source. They are mainly man-made ecosystems. For example, a city where sun is not the major energy source. But for major natural ecosystems, you think of forests, you think of deserts, grasslands, these ecosystems, and the sun is the primary source. And then one more characteristic feature which we can think of is that whenever along a food chain there is energy flow, the amount of energy availability decreases. And this decrease in the amount of energy availability is governed by the Lindemann's 10% law. Now, what does the Lindemann's 10% law tell us? It tells us that whatever energy is available at the preceding trophic level, only 10% of it is available at the succeeding trophic level. So if to the producers 100 units of energy is available, to the primary consumer only 10 units will be available. If to the primary consumer 10 units is available, to the secondary consumer only 1 unit will be available. And to the tertiary consumer only 0.1 unit will be available. To the quaternary consumer 0.01 units will be available. So that means whatever energy is available at the preceding trophic level, only about 10% of it is available to the succeeding trophic level. So this is what occurs in obedience with the Lindemann's 10% law. So I will just repeat the characteristic features of energy flow through an ecosystem. First and foremost, energy flow through the ecosystem obeys the first and second laws of thermodynamics. That is the first. Second, energy flow through the ecosystem is always unidirectional. Third, for a majority of the natural ecosystems, the sun is the source of energy. And lastly, whenever there is energy flow through the food chains, whatever energy is available at the preceding trophic level, only 10% of it is available in the succeeding trophic level. So that was in brief about energy flow through the ecosystems. Achha, now after we talk about energy flow, we shall talk about the biogeochemical cycles. Achha. Now you tell me if you have any doubts. If you have any doubts. Please tell me if you have any doubts. Okay. Now since you do not have much of a doubt, obviously you shouldn't have also, because you have studied these things in your earlier classes. And the next thing which we can talk of is the biogeochemical cycles. Now, as far as these biogeochemical cycles or nutrient cycles are concerned, they practically represent the pathway of circulation of elements within the various components of the ecosystem. So that means how elements, nutrients, etc., from the ecosystem move on to the organism, and from the organism how they come back to the ecosystem. So that is what we call as a biogeochemical cycle. Now these biogeochemical cycles, they can be of two types. One is your gaseous cycle, and the other is your sedimentary cycle. So the gaseous cycle, as far as the gaseous cycle is concerned, the major reservoir of the nutrient is either the atmosphere or the hydrosphere. So as far as gaseous cycles are concerned, the major reservoir of the nutrient is either the atmosphere or the hydrosphere, or atmosphere or the hydrosphere. So as far as the sedimentary cycle is concerned, now for these sedimentary cycles, uh, the reservoir is the earth's crust. For these sedimentary cycles, the reservoir is the earth's crust. So these two things you need to keep in mind. So nutrient cycles are those systems where we talk about how nutrients are cycled within the various components of the ecosystem. Okay, so that means how nutrients flow from the ecosystem to the body of the organism, and from the body of the organism back to the ecosystem. Now these cycles are of two types, as I said, gaseous and sedimentary. Gaseous cycles, they have their reservoir in the atmosphere or the hydrosphere, and as far as sedimentary cycles are concerned, they have their reservoir in the earth's crust. Now for your examination purpose, please note down the cycles which you will study. Please note down the cycles which you will study. Number one, you will study about the carbon cycle. uh, then you will study about the water cycle, or the hydrological cycle. Then you will study about the nitrogen cycle, and also study about the oxygen cycle. So mainly study these four gaseous cycles: water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and oxygen cycles. And regarding sedimentary cycles, you can leave them. Sulfur and calcium cycles, they do not come in the examination, so just focus on these four cycles: hydrological cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and the oxygen cycle. That will be enough for you. Okay, with that, I'll be concluding today's class, and in the next class, we will be discussing a bit more about ecosystems, and then I shall be providing you with the notes. So, tell me if you have any doubts. I'm asking you for the last time. Otherwise, I'll be ending the class. Okay, fine. Then I'm ending the class, and soon I'll be uploading the class records in the YouTube channel. Okay. Good night. Goodbye then. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Okay, sir.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.